Welcome to another Habanero webinar. Our topic today is culture. How should we think about it in our organizations? How does it connect to our organization's ability to win? And what the heck is culture anyways? Today's session should be around 25 minutes, and we won't have any live Q&A, but I would still love to hear from you. Drop your questions, your comments, your heckles, any amusing stories you might have into the Q&A feature, and I will follow up with you. I'll also be sending a link to the recording after it's done. My name is Steven Fitzgerald. I'm the president of Habanero Consulting, and I'm really excited to be here talking about this with you today. I'm going to start out today with a quick story. A few weeks ago, I was out for lunch with a friend, and we got to talking about her work. She mentioned that she had an email in her inbox, and she was really worried about it. So I asked her, why don't you just read it, see what's in it? Maybe it's not that bad. And she said, I don't want to because I don't want to get a case of the Sunday scaries. She further explained that she won't open work emails on Saturday or Sunday because the risk is too great that it'll ruin her whole weekend. We explored what this was about, and it turns out it wasn't because her coworkers were mean or her boss was uncaring. Digging a little more, we learned that the avoidance and the emotion is really symptomatic of a mismatch in how my friend and her team worked and what her organization needed from them. Her organization's culture, just like anyone's organization's culture, dictated how her and her peers acted and interacted. And in her case, it dictated that she didn't have a clear way to resolve her anxiety through direct intervention or support from others. When organizations can reduce the mismatch between the culture and what the organization needs, performance follows. Life gets much easier for people, which opens the door for all sorts of benefits like stronger relationships, deeper learning, greater levels of innovation, and, most importantly to me personally, deeper career fulfillment. All this adds up to an incredible opportunity to change performance for individuals and for the organization. And this is really the heart of the matter for us, and it's why we wanted to talk about culture in this webinar. So, quick introduction to Habanero. We're focused on unlocking people's potential in order to drive organizational performance. We do this by helping organizations improve their employee experiences, whether that's through helping them unearth and live their purpose and values, or building strong communications and community amongst employees and customers, or helping them build intentional cultures that best support the business model. And that's what today is really all about. We've been doing some interesting research about culture lately, and we've found something that I find really fascinating. Leaders are often pretty intimidated or even scared of the idea of culture. And it comes from three different directions. One is that culture just has this reputation for being this fluffy, amorphous, hard to pin down thing. And when you step out and want to take on culture on, I think a lot of leaders face skepticism from their peers because they think culture is this sort of loose thing that really doesn't have any bearing on the organization's success. The other problem is that some leaders really feel the idea of cracking the lid on culture and getting into it is like opening Pandora's box, and they don't know what they're going to find in there, and they don't know how much it's going to break the organization if they start poking around. So it's that fear of culture being like a difficult thing to get into. And then finally, we've also heard from leaders that they feel that culture work actually puts them at risk in their career, some sort of political risk or reputational risk. Our experience, though, with culture is there's an opportunity to get very clear about what it means by definition, but also specifically for an organization, and use that clarity to create this sure-footed path forward in creating an intentional culture. And the work is rewarding all the way through, and it creates this space for organizations to continually get better and reap the benefits of that on an ongoing basis. And from the point of view of what it's like to do culture work inside an organization, our experience of this is that it's produced amazing career experiences. In fact, we've worked with one CEO doing deep culture change in two different organizations, and he describes those two experiences as two of the most meaningful and best experiences of his career. So let's frame this conversation about culture. If strategy is what you're intending to do, culture is how you're going to do it. And we think this definition is terribly important. So what do we mean by culture? We like to think of culture as like an iceberg. And like an iceberg, you can see it from a long way away when you're on the water in a boat. But the part you see, even though it looks big, is really a small part of the iceberg. And you know the big part of the iceberg, the bulk of it, is below the water level, and you can't see it. And so the analog in a culture, the part above the water level that you can see, these are these readily available, observable behaviors that everyone can see and feel. In this culture, we make eye contact. We're very collaborative. It's okay to ask questions. Failing in this culture is perfectly acceptable or not. These are the things that we can pick up easily, but they're pretty hard to decipher and make meaning out of. The other thing above the water level is the ideas or the concepts that an organization chooses to curate and pull out and use as pillars of the culture. So I'm talking about things like a purpose statement, or statements of values, or a mission or vision. These are ideas that an organization can use almost as wayfinding elements to help people orient themselves to the culture and make meaning of that ecosystem. And so these can be very powerful tools to help align people around a culture. But if leaders are showing up in ways that are not lined up with these ideas, it creates dissonance for people, and that can be very negative. But by and large, these visible artifacts are very powerful and useful. Now, what about below the water level? That's where we find this system of beliefs, a shared system of beliefs. And any group of people working on something for a while together start to develop a system of shared beliefs. And it's from those beliefs that the behaviors come from that create the experiences that people feel above the water level. So what's important about this is that these beliefs work in a system. They're very connected. They work together. And they're sort of difficult to see if you're in the organization. It's almost like asking a fish what the water's like. When you're in a culture, it's hard to see those beliefs. But if you're going to create meaningful change, you need to be able to understand those beliefs and shape them. And we've all experienced this in organizations, haven't we? We know we want to make a change. We create some intervention. Behaviors change for a little while, 6 months, maybe a year and a half, but they always end up going back to what they were before. That's this really powerful element of culture. Cultures have a bit of an immunity to change. This belief system forms deep grooves in an organization. And so you can't really change them without understanding them. And if you try and change them just by changing behaviors, you generally always go back to where you were before. So I mentioned earlier, if your strategy is what you're doing, your business model, your intention, that's all what you're doing. Your culture is how you bring that to life. So an important conclusion to draw from that is that your organization must have a bespoke culture that fits that business model and those needs. It's very common for organizations to get lured into trying to mimic other people's cultures, the cultures of organizations they admire, but that will take you away from what you need for your culture. The key message here is there is not some ideal culture that we should all be going for, that every organization should be shooting for. Every organization should have one perfect bespoke culture that fits their business aspirations and where they're going. And that's a really important part of this conversation as well. Okay, so we've described what culture is and how it works. What does it take to build an intentional culture? What does it take to move your organization in a direction where you have that bespoke culture that fits your strategy and your business model? Before I dig into what the work can look like, I wanted to share an important note about sizing culture change work. Every organization has their own need and appetite for this sort of work. The ideas I'm about to share are ingredients that end up getting shaped to fit an organization's need. In the same way that it's your job as a culture champion to find the exact right culture for your strategy and business model, the approach to getting to that end state must also be shaped to fit your context. We've learned that this work is quite scalable. It can range from rapid and focused cultural assessments all the way to deeper, more fundamental change. In our experience with this type of work, it involves three main movements. The first is understanding. And this is where we get to the bottom of that iceberg and really start to understand those shared belief systems and the behaviors that come from them. Both the behaviors that serve the organization well and the ones that are not serving it well. Or maybe the ones that serve it well now and the ones that won't serve it well in the future. Next, we want to take all that synthesized output from the understanding phase and put it into a design process that helps us identify what the future ways of being will be. So we've identified culture and the way it works now, and this design phase is actually getting clear about the culture we want to move into. What is the shared belief system and what are the behaviors that come from it? And then finally, the last step is to bring it all to life. So let's talk through these. The first step is to really unearth that shared belief system and the behaviors that define your culture. And yes, that's getting to the bottom of the iceberg, understanding that system of beliefs and really the resulting behaviors that come from that. And getting into that is really part of the magic of this work. What I'm showing here is an ethnographic research portfolio of methods. It's really critical to understand how different methods produce different insights into a culture. So a lot of organizations have insight into their culture through attitudinal methods like surveys. I want to draw your attention to that vertical axis. At the bottom, we have the attitudinal methods, and at the top, we have the behavioral methods. So attitudinal methods are what people say, what they think, what they can express. Employee surveys, interviews, those are really good ways to capture attitudinal data about an organization. On the other end of the spectrum, the top of the spectrum, the behavioral methods, those are really about observing someone's behaviors and understanding how they act and show up. I think we've all experienced this idea that what people say and what they do don't always line up. So we really need to know both of those things. It's really important. And so in the behavioral qualitative zone, this is really where we get the deep, rich picture of what's happening in a culture. We use a technique called empathetic research that allows us to take a group of people, put them inside a bubble of psychological safety, and instead of asking them about their opinions about the culture, what we're doing is getting them to express what life is like at work. So we'll ask them a whole range of questions like, describe a situation where you were so excited about what happened at work, you were compelled to tell a stranger about it. Or tell us about a day when work broke your heart. Actually, a lot of the rich data comes from the middle of the road, day-to-day sort of experiences. And what we're doing is we're getting people to talk through those things. And because it's psychologically safe and they're well set up, they're able to speak from the heart. That allows our researchers to pull the themes out and give us a really rich, deep idea of what's going on in the culture. From there, we can add breadth tools like surveys to really round out our picture of what's going on. So we can get this very clear, research-backed idea of what our system of beliefs and behaviors are. In parallel with that, we work with leaders in the organization to really understand the strategy and the ambitions for the organization. Where is this organization going? What challenges is it going to face? And what do we need in the culture to really be successful in that future world? And in that journey, working with those leaders, something really interesting happens. Because we're bringing in all this really rich, clear data about how the current culture works, leaders tend to cross a little bit of an empathy gap. It's really hard as a leader to really know exactly what it's like to stand in everyone's shoes in an organization, particularly large organizations. It's not that those leaders aren't empathetic people and they are definitely trying to understand things, but it's hard at scale. But this work allows us to bring truths about the culture to those people in a way that they were never able to see it before. So they start to develop this new cultural competency with the current way of being. And that sets them up for learning more into the future way of being too. So this is a really important learning component for leaders. And finally, synthesizing this all together, we want to make sure we have all the design inputs to move on to the next phase. And of course, the next phase is design. And this is where we really get clear about that future way of being. We generally produce something called a culture blueprint that lays out the shape and dimension of what we're doing. We find the elements of the blueprint can vary based on the needs and the context of every organization. But the key is that we're able to create something that is strong enough to act as a North Star for change work ahead and give everyone in your organization a sightline into the future culture that we're working to build together. So the culture design phase has three big elements to it. One is the future system of beliefs. We've worked really hard to define the current system of beliefs, and we understand the behaviors that serve us well and the ones that we need to change to create the future that we want. And so we put all that together to create a future set of beliefs or a new way of being that acts as a target for us to grow into. And among that set of beliefs, we generally identify a few priorities. This is almost like a subsystem of beliefs that are the biggest priorities. These are the ones we really need to focus on in terms of making the biggest change. And keep in mind that they work together as a system, but there is a subsystem of high priority ones within that, and we focus on those. And finally, we want to develop something that's called a cultural metaphor or generative metaphor. These are powerful change tools. They're a way to help people tap into and cultivate right brain thinking and navigate some complexity. So these metaphors, they tend to be broad enough to allow people to continually interpret and adapt things and move forward in this meaningful and appropriate way. And they tend to help support new ways of thinking and allows people to look at old problems with a new vision, a new thought for the future, and a new way to be creative about it. The idea of generative metaphors have been around for a long time. The term sustainable development was deliberately developed as a way to help the corporate sector and the environmental sector work together to create a new future. This idea of creating some form of a generative metaphor is one of the powerful change tools we use in the process. One last thing about the design phase of this work, it's the great opportunity for leaders to start learning about working in the future way. It's kind of a confusing thing, but we really want to try and take this opportunity, even in the design phase, to allow leaders to step into acting in different ways. So an example might be if we're moving from a belief system that is constructed around a real command and control leadership style, and we're trying to move into something more autonomous and more collaborative. You don't want your CEO to say, oh my goodness, I'm so excited about this. I'm going to write a note to everyone on my leadership team and tell them how it's going to be so they're all motivated moving forward to it. Great intent, but that's behaving in the old way, and we want people to start practicing the new way as soon as possible. Okay, we've talked about understanding, we've talked about design, now we're getting into the act part. This is where we're really bringing all these ideas to life. This is where we have a beautiful opportunity to leverage all the hard work we've done to really understand the culture. There's nothing like really understanding the culture this deep way to help you architect a change journey through it. And so we're leveraging all that learning, and we want to build some components into this that are really helpful. And so with all that learning in place, we can construct an approach to moving forward and bringing this new way of being to life. And one of the parts of that we want to get on really early is building a governance structure of some type. So this governance structure needs to engage the right leaders and sponsors in the work. We generally have more of a design or a culture working group that runs point for the work. We might have things like ambassador networks and other groups within an organization to build out this fulsome structure to make sure that the right people are involved in the right conversations and the right decisions. So as I mentioned, part of this governance structure is a working group, a culture working group, or a design group. They really lead a lot of the effort to understand what the interventions will be, help design and shape those interventions, bring them to a steering committee for prioritization and funding and go ahead. But they're a highly enabled, culturally attuned group of people that have really internalized the design principles and the culture understanding. And so they're leading this work in a way that really brings the organization along. And this is usually a pretty small team inside an organization, and we sit on that team for our clients for the first while until they really gain their own competency. But it ends up being this long-standing function within a business. And then finally, an action plan. So you could call this a roadmap or a backlog of work. We really want people to think about it, though, as a group of activities that are designed to be flexible, because we really want to make sure that we're always putting our effort in the way that creates the change the most. And it's easy to get caught up in task completion and doing the work, but we want to build a system that makes sure we're always prioritizing actually creating change in the organization and changing people's belief system. And we've learned it's really helpful to push people away from thinking about this process as finding things in your culture that are broken and fixing them. Instead, we want people to think more about nurturing an organic system. Like we're trying to grow something in an organization. We're moving from one state to the other by growing it. And this is not a complicated problem. It's a complex problem, if that makes sense to you. And we want people to really rely on sensing, probing, responding, and learning our way through this and adapting and changing direction when we learn there's a better direction to go. So it becomes really about more of a nurture activity rather than this kind of project-like way of marching through tasks. So thinking about this action plan and the sort of iterative nature of it, you start out the process with a system of beliefs and behaviors that you've developed and a clear understanding of the behaviors that are serving you well and the ones that aren't serving you so well. And we've developed this blueprint that really guides the change. So the key after that is to get into the organization and try some of these interventions. It could be anything. It could be working on purpose or values. It could be working on some of the moments that matter in the employee journey, like onboarding or performance reviews. It could be leadership training and development. It could be communications. It could be all sorts of things. So we pick the highest priority things, we try them, and then we measure the impact on people's belief system. It's not going to be a dramatic change quickly, but we need to start to develop the discipline of understanding what it looks like when behaviors change. So we measure these, we learn from it, and we go back to refining the blueprint, and then we keep going. So it's this iterative process of looping through this journey of refining our design, testing it, getting it out there, trying it, learning from it, and going back and refining the design again. And when you look at the journey overall, it sort of takes this interesting shape often. When you start out with this work of clarifying the future way, people get it, they lean into it, and then people start to notice the change. And the more they notice the change, the more they start taking it seriously, and that really starts to build momentum. And then people start to learn in the learning. What we're trying to do is build an organization where people have a sense of ownership over the culture. You want as many people as possible being culture creators rather than just culture consumers. And so what happens is when people start to lean in and learn, their understanding and their expectation of what culture is grows. And so naturally, they become a little less satisfied with where they're at in that position in the organization. And there's a bit of a dip in people's perception at that point. And that's actually a good thing. It's a sign of them learning. But you need momentum to get through that dip and move up to this state where more people in the organization broadly have a sense of ownership over the culture. There's a clearer understanding of what it means and what the stakes are. And people really start to lean into that. Then we get to this point over time where the culture becomes this true strategic capability that really helps the organization find its success. So on this journey into intentional culture, it's really important to focus on visibility and transparency. People need to see the change at all levels to really believe it's happening and understand it. You really need to focus on consistency and clarity. There are lots of people in every organization that when they see change coming, they have learned to hunker down, hide from it for a while, and it'll pass. And when they surface their head back up, you'll be back to normal again. They don't have to worry about it. So being consistent and clear will help bring those people along the process and help them understand that this change is for real. You also want to include as many people as we can. We really want to lean on co-creative and co-design strategies with people in the organization. And you want them not just to feel heard, but you want to actually hear them. And the more we engage people in the organization, it's not just to help them build ownership, but it's also to learn from them, to allow subcultures and the detailed, nuanced aspects of the culture take root in all the different parts of the organization. And then finally, I mentioned this a bit on the last slide, but it's really critical to start building the muscle to be able to recognize what the new behaviors look like, how they relate to the new belief system, and how to actually pull those things out, recognize them, and show them up into the organization as progress, and communicate that into the organization. And when all this comes together, you will find right out of the gate and more over time that you're starting to reduce the number of Sunday scaries that happen in your organization, if that's something you could actually measure. But we're creating an environment where people's work, what they need to do, is starting to match more and more with how people in your organization work. And that's really the goal. We want to create this harmony between the what and the how. We want a culture that matches our business model and will stand up to our aspirations and will help our organization reach its full potential. That's really the goal here. So that's our webinar for today. Thank you so much for joining me. It was a lot of fun for me to put this together, and I hope it was enjoyable for you as well. I would love to hear the things that you're up to in your culture. Where are you finding success? Where are things not working? Love to chat about it. Reach out anytime, and good luck with your culture work. Thanks very much.